Unfortunately, at the end of the 200-meter race, Noah Lyles had disappointingly won bronze and had to be taken off the track in a wheelchair. We then found out that he was running the race after being diagnosed with COVID just 2 days earlier. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer, and my goal in this channel is to teach you about the medical side of the sports world. So this whole story is pretty shocking with Noah Lyles. We saw some impact that he might have been affected, didn't seem quite as, explosive out there in the semifinal, won bronze, and then we find out he's been running with COVID. Right off the bat, I don't think that was a dangerous, crazy decision. Remember, there's varying degrees of severity when you have a COVID-19 infection. And if you have mild or are essentially asymptomatic, no fever, no severe chest pain or severe cardiopulmonary symptoms, I think it's reasonable to have that discussion and allow the athlete to try to go out there and compete, especially when it's a short race and not a sport where you're going to be exchanging a lot of respiratory secretions and saliva like, say, basketball or soccer. You're pretty isolated on the track. It's a short duration. And so I think the decision to let him run was completely reasonable and completely safe. Now, I was disappointed to see right off the bat when he came out kind of, hyping up the crowd, some of these antics beforehand, as we'll talk about how COVID infection, the impact on your lungs, can affect your subsequent aerobic and anaerobic metabolism and the energy you have available to run a race. In a distance like the 200 meters, you're really relying on a lot of your initial kind of muscle energy stores that get exhausted after maybe just 5 to 10 seconds of explosive activity. So I really think he could have bit himself in the butt here. I don't know why he went out and did this. I don't know why he was jumping around and using up all this extra unnecessary energy beforehand when he knew he had COVID and knew he was going to have to rely on those initial energy stores. I guess you could argue maybe he's trying to get that adrenaline going, but adrenaline's only going to get you so far. You still rely on basic biology, and everything beforehand with him running around and jumping, kind of showboating out there, used up a lot of energy stores that were not necessary and could have been preserved for the race. We'll start off by talking about our lung anatomy and how that could be affected when you have a COVID infection and then affect your performance. But first, I want to give a shout out to the sponsor of this video. Today's video is sponsored by Bombas. Bombas makes the most comfortable versions of things you wear every day, from socks and underwear to t-shirts. Designed to feel good and do good. With one purchased equaling one donated, Bombas has given away over 100 million clothing items to people in need. Their ankle running socks are my personal favorite. They've got this really nice little built-up support in the back so that your heel doesn't rub and get blisters, nice little built-in arch support, and this seamless design where you don't have any annoying seam to worry about at the edge of your toe. Right now, new customers can get 20% off their first purchase by heading to bombas.com/BrianS and use code BrianS at checkout. And if you're looking for more specialty athletic socks, Bombas has a great lineup to suit everyone's need. They've got a taller tube sock style if you like that design, a nice variety of fabrics like merino wool that really helps to regulate temperature, thin, lightweight running sock, and even these extra tall socks that are perfect if you're a big skier or snowboarder. And remember, one purchased equals one donated. So not only are you giving yourself a great pair of socks, but you're also helping to provide for someone else in need. With 100% happiness guarantee, there's no excuses not to head to bombas.com/BrianS, scan the QR code on screen, use code BrianS for, again, first-time customers to get 20% off. If we talk about lung anatomy, we can get a better understanding of how an active COVID, or for that matter, any respiratory infection, could affect your athletic performance during a race. Essentially, a virus like COVID virus is going to affect your respiratory system. It's going to affect your lungs. As you have that virus in there, as your body's immune system is reacting, it's going to produce some fluid. That fluid can build up in these little air sacs we have throughout our lungs called the alveoli. Our lungs are trying to exchange oxygen. Blood is flowing through, air is moving in, and we're trying to exchange oxygen from the lungs into the blood to get that oxygen to our body. To do that, we want to have maximal surface area for the blood to come in close proximity with the oxygen. We do that by having these multiple little tiny air sacs called alveoli. The more of these air sacs you have, the more surface area you create, therefore the more potential for that gas exchange across that barrier into the blood to get oxygen. Now, if you have fluid that builds up, you decrease your available alveoli surface area, you decrease the amount available for air exchange, and so you can have difficulty getting adequate oxygen uptake from your lungs into your blood. And that poor oxygen uptake can downstream affect specifically your aerobic respiration, being one of the main things that would impact an athletic performance when you're dealing with any sort of viral respiratory infection. Obviously, there's other systemic immune things that are going on where you can have increase in these acute phase reactants that can make you just feel really crummy. The fever, potentially, you could have possible cardiac side effects that could affect your cardiac output and the blood pumping. The energy currency, or what our muscles need to contract and to fire and for our cells to function, is called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Think of it as the currency of our metabolism. So your body is trying to produce as much ATP as possible during athletic performance to then have maximal muscle contraction and maximal power output. There are different ways that our body produces ATP depending on whether or not we have abundant oxygen supply or we don't. We call those aerobic or anaerobic, and without, so anaerobic is without or limited oxygen. Whenever you're doing a short burst, a short duration, rapid sort of energy expenditure event, like say the 100-meter dash, that first 5 to 10 seconds, most of that is coming from anaerobic metabolism. The primary way that's done in the first 5 to 10 seconds is through the utilization of ATP from this phosphocreatine stored within our muscles. There's a reaction in our muscles where this phosphorus gets cleaved off that phosphocreatine, connected up with an ADP, and then together those produce ATP, which is going to be used by our muscles for contraction. This is the quickest, this is the initial way that we're going to get energy production, and it's going to be done essentially without oxygen or anaerobic. During a 100-meter sprint, like when Lyles won, that's going to be the main mechanism by which he's producing energy for his muscles to fire. So you can see where if you go out there and you do a lot of explosive jumping, you're kind of clowning around on the track beforehand, you might use up some of your phosphocreatine stores and not have as much available to have that optimal energy production right away. The next system that comes into play is the anaerobic, so still limited oxygen, glycolysis. This is where we're taking glucose or sugar, again, predominantly stored in those muscles, and converting that sugar into byproducts of ATP and then energy. This is where we build up a lot of that initial lactate or lactic acid. And so sometimes this is referred to as the lactic acid or the lactate system. This system is what's starting to kick in during that 10 to 20 seconds when you're running a 200 meter. It's not relying on just the phosphocreatine in your muscle. It's relying more on that glucose, on that sugar. And one of that byproducts is going to be the lactic acid. And now, it's important to realize too, that lactic acid is not what causes the burn in your muscle. It's more the hydrogen ions that are kind of a byproduct. And how athletes are able to turn over and control that lactate buildup determines a lot of their peak performance. We call it the lactate threshold, and it's where you're able to control the metabolism of how quickly your body is turning over and reusing that lactate that's produced during this anaerobic glycolysis. The final step is then aerobic glycolysis, where we're using oxygen, we're converting primarily glucose into these subsequent byproducts, and as a result, we're producing ATP. When you look at research on which system is being utilized during a 100 or a 200 meter, predominantly during a 100 meter, it's a lot of this anaerobic. It's that phosphocreatine store in your muscle that's being used to produce that ATP. When you get into the 200 meter, it's probably somewhere around 3/4 is still more of that anaerobic, whether it's the anaerobic glycolysis with the lactic acid system or the phosphocreatine, and then you start bringing in some percentage of aerobic. My point being with all that is that in a race like the 200 meter, you're not relying as much on oxygen for production of energy. So if he had been trying to run a 1500 meter or longer, or even the 800 meter where you're relying more on those aerobic systems, you're going to have more of an impact of having that infection, of having poor ventilatory capacity in your lungs when you're relying more on the oxygen. But because he's running a race where he's not as dependent on those aerobic metabolism mechanisms, yes, you're still going to be affected, don't get me wrong, but it's not going to be as major as, say, somebody playing a whole game of basketball, trying to run a full game of soccer or football, or running a much longer race. Assuming he doesn't develop any fever, assuming he doesn't take a turn for the worse, I think it would be reasonable to try and run in the 4x100 because, again, you're not relying as much on that oxidative phosphorylation, that aerobic metabolism to produce energy. And so I think it would be reasonable for him to try, but it's possible he'll just be feeling so crummy he won't be able to hydrate as much, and just the COVID infection itself will kind of progress down to where he just doesn't feel like he can give it a go. I still don't think it's dangerous for him to be out there trying to compete. I think good to use proper contact precautions and mask up as soon as he can afterwards so you don't risk spreading it to the other medical caregivers. But I don't think it was dangerous. If he suddenly developed a fever, that would be a different discussion and a different story. But so far, I think it's okay that he was out there running. Good on him for trying to give it a go, and hopefully this helps you understand a little bit about these energy production systems, how COVID could have affected it, or how it might not have. Thank you as always for watching, and until next time, we'll see you later.